Hello adventurers and welcome back to my channel. As I was driving through Idaho, I found something that I thought that you and I might enjoy doing. Now we are currently at one of the oldest missions in all of Idaho, and we're going to take a little bit of a tour, but first we're going to check out the visitor center and gift shop and then figure out exactly what all we can see here. This is going to be fun, so I hope you're up for an adventure. Let's go. Oh wow, we start off with a Dugout Canoe. This is incredible. This would have been around at the time of the first people of this area, and they would hollow out trees to create canoes that they could use for fishing and then also for going across the waterways to get to other places that they could then source food. Now, as you're traveling around Idaho, there are a variety of different signs that you'll find, little brown signs that point you in the direction of various points of interest. Along the way, I found this one, and I saw a sign just a short distance up from the actual entry point. And so it was a pretty quick turnoff, but I'm so excited about this because I've heard good things. I don't know exactly what to expect though, so we're about to find out. Before we go inside, a few fun facts. Approximately 5.5 million visitors come to Idaho state parks per year, and they spend approximately $127 million. First and foremost, it is a camera-free zone, so I wasn't able to film anything inside. However, that does not mean that I'm not able to share things that I found inside. There's a museum inside that's $5. There's also a video, which I highly recommend because it tells you the entirety of the story of the mission itself. They also have some great brochures and things like that to pick up, so go inside and check it out. They have a visitors center gift shop that I picked up a patch at, so all of this was a great first stop. Now, just a few little tips. Again, you can drive up or you can walk up depending on when you're visiting, and there are some interesting things to note. Fun fact, the visitor center was created in 1979 so that they could have special displays like the museum inside, and they can also have special events and things like that so that people can relate to the content. But also it gives you an opportunity to have that video and then again special talks. So that was 1979 when that was originally fashioned. But the story of this place goes well back into the 1800s, and I think that's what's really fascinating. In the 80s they did a little bit of an update on the Parish House here, which we're about to see, and they moved it away from the actual mission a few years before that because they wanted it to not be a fire hazard because they had experienced some really not so great things in the past. But we'll talk about all that when we get up to the top of the hill. Well, now this is the Old Mission State Historic Park, and it's pretty interesting because I learned that originally this area was all occupied by the Coeur Indians, and the tribes that were here at the time, they all were introduced to horses at one point, which made them much more mobile. And whenever they became much more mobile, it really changed the way that they were able to kind of navigate through this crazy place that we call a planet. Before, they were all on foot, or they had those dugout canoes and kayaks that they could use, but that was about it. But then they got introduced to the horses, and so they were starting to move around a lot more. And around that time, there was some interesting talk about a Jesuit group who had created a mission. And this mission was quite a distance away from where we are currently. But the Coeur d'Alene people, as well as many of the other tribal groups, were interested in what exactly this was. So they started to kind of inquire as the Jesuits would come to the region. And long story short, the man who had made the first mission in all of Idaho happen came to the Coeur d'Alene area and started talking to those native people, and they were interested. They were very interested. They could see parallels between what they believed and how the Jesuits believed. They thought that the Gregorian chanting that they would do very similarly resembled the things that they would do in their own spiritual practices. They also related to the burning of the incense very similarly to the burning of the sage that they would do within their own practices. And so they were very interested. However, they first started out with temporary structures about 35 miles from here, and they faced a lot of flooding and really horrific weather. And in doing so, they discovered they were going to have to be in a different place. So they moved up to this region, and in doing so, it opened up a wide variety of possibilities. They were able to move basically onto the property and still use the same practices that they had when it came to foraging and finding things, and they would use weaponry and tools only for food and hunting. Some of the Coeur d'Alene people were hesitant. They weren't as sold on this idea, but the ones who did relate on that level and wanted to come here actually worked tirelessly to build the mission that we were about to see, the first iteration of it. They did it all by hand, and it took 6 years to complete the entirety of the structure, working on each tiny little painstaking piece until finally it became a reality. Not just a reality, something that they really believed in. Now, as we visit the property, there are a series of signs that tell us a bit more about the story of this great mission, and also some of the items from the original mission that are still here today for us to see. Despite this being a labor of love and something that was so important, a lot of things happened in history, and we'll get to those as we kind of move around. But now this is a place for us to come to remember those things. I always say, learn from the past to make a better tomorrow. But in order to do that, we have to actually dive into the symbolic nature of what it is that we have seen and learned about, and how it can impact us here in this present moment. And I think that through these signs and the story of this unique mission, we will do just that. Here it says, at sundown, the church bell would sound and the worshipers would come, and they would be inside of the area, and the Indians are very devout and they believed in the great practice, and many of the aged people from the church would be totally blind and walking hand and feet so bowed with age, but they would still come. And it's very important to know that this was something that gave them so much peace and hope. On the property there are several structures. I'm going to take a little stroll around. It's a little windy today, so it feels pretty nice out here, but I want to share with you some of the different views and also the perspectives before we go back up to the main mission to talk a little bit more about what exactly happened. As we move down the hill a bit, we get to a grist mill area, and this was a horse-powered grist mill, and it was shown with a half timber frame, which looks like this, and brother blacksmith, either Charles Hewitt or Klassen, and brother McGree collaborated on fashioning this particular grist mill in 1848, and this would have been before the construction of the mission actually even started to take place. The mill would serve the mission during its active years, as well as all of the pioneer settlers later on. So it wasn't that it was very big. In this particular representation, this is only about half, but this still, even at double, would not be very large. Now this sits just down the hill from the mission. They chose the mission's spacing and placement because it was at the highest point on the property. This was all a little bit lower lying, and so if there was a lot of water, which they faced at that previous location, it would come down and just keep on going. And so it wouldn't really impact these levels because they were built up quite a bit from the plains area. And so I can see how that could definitely be beneficial. But also they put in infrastructure long before the mission was actually completed because it took them so long to build it. 6 years is a long time when you're doing everything by hand. A few things that were done by hand that were of note in the video, they actually created their own light fixtures using tin cans that they would poke holes through using a pocket knife so that the light could escape out and make a beautiful light for inside. All of the paintings inside the mission were hand painted. All of the pieces of the actual supports and walls, you can see these little pins right here. They were created using this pin system, which would drive these in and use it kind of like a nail through the wood. And so they did this, but in a much larger scale up at the top of the hill. On top of that, whenever newspaper became more readily available, they took the regular wall on the inside that was just kind of boring and bland, and they basically wallpapered the walls in newspaper. Now again, there are a lot of different paths here, so you can go down to the West Cemetery in this direction, or you can stop off at the first one at the beginning of the entrance, and tons of information about these. There's another path that departs out in this direction, but it is not labeled as to what's in that direction from a sign perspective. Okay, so now as we walk back up, let's talk a bit more about the construction. So if you were a person from the tribe, from the Coeur d'Alene tribe, that didn't necessarily mean that you could help build the mission. You had to have exemplary behavior because that was a sign of discipline. And ultimately, within any kind of religious faith, discipline is rewarded. You get to be closer to and be a part of. The building itself is 90 feet by 40 feet. Again, all done originally by hand. So it was not a task that was easy. It took quite a while, and it took a lot of work beyond just the building of the mission, because all of this property here had to be worked, maintained, and they had to make it where people could live here also. So, as a result, many of the teepee structures would be set up in these plains areas right here. But in addition, other structures were on property. And in 1860s, multiple structures that looked just like this were set up, and that would hold all of the people who would be visiting. And they'd probably be located right in this area somewhere. The people who stayed here along the way included settlers, included a governor of a territory, and many others who were trying to get from point A to point B. The mission was a safe space, a stopover. It was a great place for people who were passing through the area to have a safe interaction where they could be, instead of being out in the wild, wild west, so to speak. At the same time, though, when the white people started coming here, they didn't really necessarily understand that they had a very copacetic relationship going on, where the indigenous people, the Indian people, and the Jesuit people lived in harmony, in unison, and this was a sacred place for all of them. So it started some tiffs, and at one point, one of the priests had to step up and say, no, we're not going to do this. We're going to find peace. So he instigated these talks for a treaty, and a treaty eventually began to shape the way that this area would look. In his intention to create peace between the two groups, his intentions were pure. He wanted people to get along. He wanted people to see each other as equals. However, what ended up happening was a treaty happened, and it was followed by a reservation, which didn't include the very mission that many of the Indians not only built, but believed in. And of course, that caused a lot of problems. People felt as though their heritage was ripped from them in several ways. And the priests stood by and tried to help, but once they were told that they would not be within that range, there wasn't much that they could do. Now, a new mission was constructed on the res, but it later went on to burn. So many of the people were displaced from their faith. I think that's the sadder part of this story. It started out as something where it was just this great relationship, and it turned into something really ugly, as do many parts of history. But ultimately, there is still faith. There are still people. And every year in August, the Coeur d'Alene people still come and they celebrate here at the property at the old mission. See, the Coeur d'Alene people had been using this property in these areas since well before the mission. This is where they lived, where they sought food, where their families developed. And this is the Coeur d'Alene people's property. Even if it's now subdivided up into regular everyday people's places, this all is very special to the tribal people.
The legends that my grandmother used to tell us, that was that place.
Now throughout the surrounding, there are various things that you can interact with, the signs, and then also there are some sections where you can push a button and hear actual voices from the elders, sometimes the songs, you get to hear stories, and it's definitely something that I encourage you guys to just take the time and press a couple buttons and just sit back, look at the beauty around you. It is absolutely gorgeous here, but we have a lot more to cover. I'm going to go show you some of the views. We're going to talk about the parsonage. We're going to find out what happened with the mission, and we're also going to try to peek in some windows. Learn about the parsonage house, and this was a permanent house for the Superior Mission, and it was shown to be a stone foundation. Now, this particular sketch right here is based on what they think it looked like, and the parsonage served as the mission's parsonage till 1864, and then it was completely destroyed by a fire. So fortunately, at that point, the church was spared, but they did lose this structure. With this beautiful, spectacular view, we learn about the steamboat transfer point and the mission landing. The Coeur d'Alene River is moderately visible from this vista. Although, because the trees are out right now, it's kind of harder to see it. It says that the river aided in popularizing the Sacred Heart mission by creating steamboat access for outlying communities. Now down below, you can see a waterway, but I don't know if that's the waterway we're looking for. That looks pretty slow moving, low and stagnant. Lots of lily pads in there, but beautiful views just the same. Just one thing after the next, like it's just view after view. You can see why the Coeur d'Alene people felt so connected to this property, because it put them in the space of just such tranquility. The road now you can hear kind of from a distance. However, at that time there was no road. Until there was. There were two particular forts that they needed to connect, and that's when the road that we more commonly see now was developed. It was much different then. It wasn't like a huge highway with buzzing by big vehicles. It was much smaller. However, that did bring in a secondary influx of the white people. And in doing so, it caused more tensions. And again, they had to go to bat to try to fix this issue, which ultimately is what led to the reservations. So there's a whole history to be discovered here about the movement of the people and their faith. Now, the sad part of the reservation was when they were disconnected from their church, they felt as though they were disconnected from their God, because they were taught that this was basically God's house, and they were connecting with something that they had built with their own hands to honor their God. And so not only, again, was the land, the beautiful land, taken, also portions of the thing that connected them to their faith. And I think that any group should be able to celebrate their faith in the ways that they see fit. And as long as they're not bothering anybody, who cares, you know? But that wasn't always the feeling, and that's why it ended the way it did. But we're finally going to go find out what happened next. Peeking in a window could be much harder than I thought. This is a standard table, and I'm not going to stand on the table to be able to see in the windows. Mission as well as the Parish House were both pretty far gone. They were not in great shape. They had kind of been abandoned at one point. So see, whenever they stopped having the Indian people here, the patronage of the mission went way, way down. And in doing so, it basically made this kind of a wayward point for a few people, but not near as many. And so they didn't use the mission as much as they had. However, they did still use the other parish house. The parish house was used to bring in novice Jesuits who were interested in being in the field and making an impact. And they would train them. And they would also harvest hay in this area and sell it to the cavalry because of the two forts. But another thing that they did at this very location was that they would help out the mining communities, because the mining started to boom in these areas. But at some point, they just weren't having the people in here. And so there were some slim years, and the more slim that it became and the resources started to dwindle, the more the Jesuits started to see that this was not going to be their forever home. And they eventually moved on. It was left in disrepair. Vandals came in and did all sorts of terrible things, from ripping up some of the floorboards to burn them, to writing on the walls. And at one point, they started to take the relics, the things, the very important hand-done things that so many before them had done, because they had more value. Of course, as you can see, picnic tables, a wheelchair lift, all of these signs, they're here now. And that's all because in 1925, somebody thought that it would be a shame to lose this amazing mission. It took them several years, 5 to be exact, but at some point they determined that this property that was originally constructed between 1850 and 1853 was worth saving. It's not only a state park, but it's also a registered National Historic Landmark and the oldest standing structure in Idaho. All because somebody way back in 1925 had the forethought to think, wow, this place is pretty incredible. Every detail of this needs to be seen for future generations so they can understand what happened here, how there was peace amongst the Indians and the Jesuits, and how things happened in history through this location, whether it be the miners coming through, the trappers, the traders, or even the military. And all of those points are part of Idaho history. So I think this is pretty incredible. Now, in 1962, it was listed on that national registry. A few short years later, in 1975, that's whenever it became the state park that we see it as today. Now, since then, a lot has been done. Obviously, you can imagine a lot of this was stripped away as a result of the vandalism. So they had to go in and basically pull this thing down to the original studs, the studs that the indigenous people had put together. The ones that they used these tiny little pins to make sure it stood sturdy. They reinforced everything, they replaced the siding, they had to replace a lot of the flooring, but they tried to do so in original construction techniques. And so a lot of the things that you see now, even though they may have been renovated to make them more sturdy, are still pretty cool and close to the original. But now let's go inside, since you have all the context, and see this incredible place. Oh, wow. In the original construction, they used these panels, and they have made sure to keep them intact. This is so amazing. At no point on the outside would you expect it to look like this on the inside. Confessional is still here, and a history of the entirety of the building, including Father Pierre Jean Desmet, the man who made everything happen. But not just the man who made everything happen, the man who bridged the gap between the Indians of the area and also the church. He went on to learn several native languages from what I was seeing, and he would speak to the Indians in their languages. And he really wanted to make a difference, and he wanted to spread the word of God, but also he wanted people to be in peace with one another and in harmony, because he believed that that's how the world's supposed to be. And I think we could all learn from that a little bit. The world's been pretty crazy lately, and so even though I know a lot of times history is depicted that all of these missions came in and they just were really terrible, I feel like in some cases they weren't. And learning that makes us all a little bit better. So I think that this is a great way for us to just take all this in. And I'm going to show you all of the different views and let you see some of these incredible works, because it's so amazing in here. Like, I don't know that the video is going to do it the justice of walking in and having that initial smell of the old come at you, but in such a rewarding way. But this is just so incredible, and to know how much love went into each piece of this from the Indians, how many people like congregated together and saw this as a way to have a beautiful community. And then to think after how it was taken from them. Can you imagine the stories that this place would have? 150 years, over 150 years of history in this. And it's just as incredible as you would expect it to be, because it's just so vibrant. The colors that they have used are just, they're in your face. They stand out. They're not just the bland neutrals that a lot of times we see today. They're vibrant, they tell stories, and you can see the attention to detail here was truly a labor of love. So this is incredible. I just keep looking around. I've been in here probably 15 minutes just in this big cavernous space, and the closer that you get to those sections up at the front, the more that you see the tiny little details. So this is amazing. We have one more place to go here on property, so I'm going to go ahead and do that, but I'm going to take a couple more minutes here because... Now this is the parishioner's home, and originally at one point they had 2 bedrooms upstairs which would sleep 5 people each. It was closer to the actual mission, and they had to move it because of the fire hazards, because they had experienced so many bad things with fire. But it's not that far, it's not that far. This one does have a window that says open, so we're going to go in. Up only a few stairs and inside we go. Oh, there's an audio going on, but before we get to that, this is the Parish House. It was the private residence of the Catholic priests and brothers of the Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits. And as you can see, it says the first parish house burned down in 1864, but was replaced later that year. And then this building was constructed in 1887, and it was the home until 1918. It also served as a training center like we were talking about. Inside this display, you can see just how bad of a shape that this was in. and what work that they did to save the Parish House. This thing was basically falling apart. You can see both it and the mission, how close they were together, and then also how they were just in ill repair. It also shows you them relocating the building in these photos, and then basically having to go down to bare bones to renovate. This is pretty much the timeline of the events that we were talking about outside to kind of set the context, but you can see it visually here play out. You can find some of the awesome things that they've had here for mining. You enter each room, and audio will start playing that tells you the story
concerning good manners at table.
This room right here is amazing. These are some of the original pieces from the house chapel, and the lives of the Jesuits at the old mission centered around prayer, and they congregated in the chapel every morning at 5:30 a.m. for meditation, and then they did mass an hour later. And everyone would gather at 9 for litany. So it was a very big deal. Prayer was huge within this community, and they took that very seriously. There is a staircase. You cannot go up it, but that's where the 2 rooms that had 5 people per room would have been. This wasn't a large home. It was kind of small, but they had enough room for everything that they needed, and they lived a pretty simple life. I think it's pretty incredible what all we can learn by listening to history and letting it kind of play out before us. Learning about a place like this that might seem like a super small stop with only a couple buildings, but in all reality, it is a great history lesson in this area, but also other areas. We get to learn about the unique connections that people had and how people could work together to achieve great things. And I think that's pretty incredible. But as we wrap up today's tour, I hope you guys have enjoyed coming along with me to the Old Mission State Park here in Idaho. It has been an experience, to say the least. I've thoroughly enjoyed coming along with you guys. And remember, we're not here for a long time, but we are here for a good time. Make sure that whatever legacy that you have is one that matters. Till next time, bye. This place was epic.